Hey, whoa, back up. Not quite that far. Today, we're talking about distance, specifically narrative distance. This is related to, but not quite the same thing as point of view, although, as we'll learn, narrative distance is an important consideration when it comes to choosing a point of view, and different POVs will give you different options. Narrative distance affects the intimacy of your story. It determines whether the reader will feel like they're watching a movie or seeing the story through your character's eyes. It determines whether your story is heavier on the narrator's voice or the character's voice, among other things. Understanding narrative distance is crucial to getting the tone and feel of your story right and ensuring that readers connect with your characters. So let's talk about narrative distance, what it is, and how it affects your story. Can the people way in the back still hear me? Narrative distance describes the distance between the narrator of the story and the characters taking part in it. Stories describe both external events as well as internal events. Internal events being things like character thoughts and emotions. The narrative distance of a story is described by how much access the reader has to those internal events. When the story describes a lot of internal events, it is said to have a close narrative distance. When we are further away from those things, the story is said to have a larger narrative distance. The further away a story gets from those internal events, the more objective it is said to be. At the farthest end of the narrative distance spectrum, we get stories that are completely objective, almost like a description of a video of what's going on in the story. We aren't even told the characters' names and certainly don't get any insight into what they're feeling. The closer we get, the more the thoughts and emotions of the characters start to color the scene. The closest you can get, narrative distance-wise, is a stream of consciousness type scene where the entirety of the scene is described through characters' thoughts and emotions. As you move from far to close narrative distance, you're essentially dialing up the amount of character voice that is coloring the scene. The POV that you choose may or may not have a narrative distance built in. First and second person perspective, by virtue of being told directly from the perspective of a character, naturally have a very close narrative distance. It could be argued that it's almost impossible to write an objective first-person perspective since everything that's being told is being told directly by the character. Since the narrator and the character are the same person, it makes it hard for either to be objective. In third person, you have a bit more choice. A third objective perspective is written with a very large narrative distance. In this type of perspective, we don't get any character thoughts or really understand anything about the emotions of the character. It's kind of like we're just watching the story through a movie camera. Now, you might think that a closer narrative distance is always better. I always say that stories are about emotional engagement, and in order to do that, it would make sense to talk about emotions and thoughts of the characters. The truth is, the best narrative distance depends on the story and even the scene that you happen to be writing. You are not required to stick with one narrative distance for an entire story or even for an entire scene. In fiction, it's usually pretty rare to be at either extreme. Very, very objective narrative distances or very, very close stream of consciousness can both be done, but it's much more common and I would say much easier to be somewhere in the middle. This gives us a nice blend of easy to digest description that is very objective and lots of character thoughts and emotions that will allow the reader to get connected with the story. Understanding how different narrative distances affect the story can be used to your advantage. More objective narrative distance can make a scene feel colder. It adds an air of mystery to a scene. Describing a violent or bloody scene in an objective way almost makes the events more brutal since you're denying the reader any sort of emotional catharsis. You also need to consider what character the perspective is from. Do you want the reader to establish a deeper connection with that character, or do you want the character to feel distant and unavailable? I don't know if this is necessarily true, but I feel like if you write a character perspective from a closer narrative distance, the reader is probably more likely to be sympathetic to that character and possibly more likely to like that character. This means that if you have a character you want to be unlikable, it might help to write their perspectives from a bit further away. A closer narrative distance is also going to make each of your viewpoints feel more distinct, since we are seeing more and more thoughts of that character. Now, this is usually a good thing because we want our characters to be different and we want their viewpoints to stand out. Where this can cause issues, potentially, is with the tone or feeling of your story. You either need to make every character seem the same to maintain the tone, or you need to deal with the varying of the tone. An example of where this could come into play is if you have a very pessimistic character and a very optimistic character. If you write both of their viewpoints from a very close narrative distance, then the tone of their viewpoints is going to be different. Now, this isn't necessarily a problem, but if you want the reader to feel always optimistic or always pessimistic about the character's situation, then you can see how switching between those two tones could be a bit of an issue. A more objective narrative also lends itself well to unreliable narrators in certain situations, since it's easier to hide things from the reader if we aren't seeing every single thought of that character. As I mentioned before, you don't need to stick with one narrative distance for an entire story. You can vary depending on what works best for a given scene. That being said, I don't think narrative distance is something you really need to give a lot of thought to. To be honest, I wouldn't spend much time thinking about narrative distance unless a particular scene is giving you problems. If a scene isn't landing the emotional notes that you want it to, it could be that it's too objective and lacks the connection to the characters. Or it could be that it's a little too close and you need to pull back a little bit. If you're drafting, I would add in those closer narrative elements like free and direct speech or character thoughts, or let the character voice seep into the prose when you feel it's appropriate, and only really think about narrative distance when you're editing or you're trying to change the feeling or the tone of a scene. Think of it as a tool to evaluate how well a scene is working and an axis that you can change things along if you feel like there's a problem. Just like I'm glad there wasn't a problem with this video, assuming you watched it all and didn't have a problem with it. So there you have it. I hope you enjoyed this video and found the advice in it useful. If you want to see more stuff like this, you can check out all my other writing advice related videos and subscribe to my channel. I post new videos every Wednesday. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.